It gives me a great honor and it's a tremendous privilege to introduce Don Krausz, originally from Rotterdam in Holland. So Don, thank you so much for agreeing to meet me tonight here in Johannesburg, in South Africa. A legend.
It's a pleasure.
So Don, you are the South African chairman of the Holocaust survivors in Johannesburg.
In Johannesburg, yes.
Yeah. And you were born in Rotterdam.
In one of the suburbs.
Can I ask what year?
1930.
1930. If you can tell us a little bit what you remember, your first memory from Holland, from those times.
You see the big picture over there? Now, Rotterdam, the whole medieval centre of Rotterdam, was eliminated by the Luftwaffe in 1940. That picture was taken before 1940. I remember playing at the back there of the school, of that picture.
I'm just going to, for our viewers, I'm going to just show. So this is Rotterdam that before the war. And did you grow up in a Jewish area of Rotterdam? Was there a Jewish area or it was a mixed area?
I wasn't aware of it.
Okay. And
My mother being English, my father being Hungarian, we weren't really all that involved with the Jewish community.
Did you go to a Jewish school?
No.
And you
went to only private school, primary school.
And you had Jewish and non-Jewish friends?
Yeah. As did my father.
And did you grow up in, was it a religious household or a Zionistic household?
Not really. Zionistic, yes.
But you were aware that you were Jewish?
Oh, yes.
A traditional household?
Yes. But our home was destroyed in the bombing of Rotterdam. And about 6 months later, and we left to go to a city called The Hague. I don't know if you've been there.
I've been.
And listen, there are biscuits there are sugar there.
It's all good. It's all good. Thank you very much. It's all good. You were around 10 years old.
I'm sorry?
You were around 10 years old at this time.
When the war started, I was 9 years old.
9 years old.
But I lived through the bombardment. We went to another town where my father had a half-sister. And we lived there with them. I went to school there for about 6 months. Then my father came back to Rotterdam and he restarted his business. He was a merchant of Persian carpets. Now, a lot of his customers were German military. And I think that makes me sure that he never had a mezuzah on his door.
And maybe they didn't know that he was
Before
Jewish.
the war, yes.
Yeah.
But not at the time.
And were you living in The Hague at this time when your father came back, or you came back with him to?
He came back with him to Rotterdam.
To Rotterdam.
Yeah.
And were you forced to wear the yellow star?
No, because the Hungarians were allies of the Germans. You know, the Hungarians had a contingent that fought at Stalingrad on the German side. So we did not have to wear the yellow star because we were Hungarians. We were allies of the Nazis. Right?
And then what happened after you came back to Rotterdam?
Rotterdam was bombed in May 1940. Rotterdam was invaded in May 1940. Rotterdam was bombed 4 days later. About 6 months later, we came from The Hague back to Rotterdam. So this would have been at the beginning of 1941. By September 1942, we were amongst the first contingents of Jewish Jews that were taken to the camps. And that took us to a camp called Ravensbruk. You may have heard of it.
I did. That's where Hannah Goslar went as well.
Well, all the Jews,
all the Jews from here. And you couldn't hide the fact that you were Jewish in Rotterdam. You couldn't.
No. You see, my father must have been a member of the congregation. And the Germans got hold of the membership lists. That's all they had to do. Anyway, from Ravensbruk, because we were Hungarians, my mother and about another 80 Hungarian Jews were sent to the Ravensbruk concentration camp. My father went to Buchenwald. He didn't survive there. When I turned 14, I was transferred from the Ravensbruk women's camp, where I was with my mother and sister, to the men's camp. From the men's camp, when the Russians approached, Ravensbruk at the time was about 80 kilometers north of Berlin. When the Russians approached, we were transferred to Sachsenhausen. Sachsenhausen was 20 kilometers north of Berlin. And there again, when the Russians approached and the camp was evacuated, we were put on a death march. And eventually we were liberated by the Russians.
And you must have vivid memories of your time in the different camps.
I've got memories. I managed to escape from the Sachsenwald camp, Sachsenhausen camp. I managed to get to the Dutch barrack in Sachsenhausen. And there they'd been virtually told to expect me and another Dutch boy. From there we went onto the death march.
Wait, can I ask, how did you manage to escape?
You probably wouldn't know about it, but there was a film shown here called The Counterfeiters. Does that name mean anything to you?
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it, but I've heard of it.
The film The Counterfeiters was made about a barrack in Sachsenhausen where money was forged. The Germans managed to copy the British 20-pound notes so well that the British couldn't tell the difference. Until eventually the British were forced to withdraw their British 20-pound note. The Germans were using it to pay their spies all over the world, British currency, but it was made in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Anyway, very close to the end of the war. I wake up one morning and I hear shooting. Now, by that time, Ravensbruk had been evacuated, but the Jews and the Gypsies had been put into a special contingent. It was a camp within the camp. You understand German at all?
A little from Yiddish.
Ein Vernichtungslager. Vernichtungslager is a destruction camp. Okay. And that camp was used. The sole purpose of that camp was, it was the last stop before the terminus. From there you went into the gas chamber. Right? It had no furniture. You slept on the deck. It had no food. Anyway, one day I hear shooting. And I get out of bed. There was no bed. I go to the gate. This little camp was a camp within the camp. It had an entrance on one side and an entrance on the other side. Each with its own guards, with its own electrified wire, the works. It was a camp within the camp. And I go to see what all the shooting's about. And I find that the guard, the SS guard, at the one end of the camp, and right behind our camp was this counterfeiters camp. It was known in the camp that gold was kept there, the teeth, the gold teeth that were extracted from people were kept there. And who were the people that knew about it? All these concentration camps, as far as I know, they were built by German criminals, the people with the green triangles. And when they realized that the Russians were on their doorstep, they stormed this barrack of the counterfeiters to try and lay their hand on as much of the treasure as they could. I don't know how much they got hold of, but the guard at that gate, he moved from here to where that entrance is to watch the shooting. And I ran back inside the camp. I had a Dutch boy with me who I brought out. He died about a year ago. And I got hold of him. I got hold of my Dutch blanket, which is still there. We ran towards the gate, and we very nonchalantly and quietly ambled out. In the meantime, I'd established contact with the Dutch contingent in the concentration camp. So I knew in which barrack they were. I knew the number of the barrack. And we made our way to that barrack. The Dutch accepted us. And the next thing was a death march.
Wait, so it's like from the frying pan into the fire.
That death march was aptly named. Anybody who couldn't march was shot.
Wait.
As simple as that. You were literally walking over the corpses of the people that had been shot in the column in front of you.
And what month was this? This was near the end of the war.
That was 2 weeks before the end of the war.
And the weather, do you recall? It must have been
I'm sorry?
The weather, was it very cold?
It was, we were liberated on the 2nd of May. It was cold for us.
When you were marching, did you ever think you were going to get out alive?
You know, as a child, you don't think of these things. we would stop marching with when the sun went down. I remember very distinctly, literally dropping where I was. Couldn't walk any further. Absolutely exhausted. And the following morning, what I do also remember very distinctly was the agony I went to try and get up. You know the story of Gulliver chained to the floor? That's how we were. You could not move. And all the time you were being machine gunned from the air by the Russians, by the Americans, by the British. It reached a stage where if you as much as heard the sound of a diving plane, you were off that road and you were gone. You jumped off the road. I remember one occasion we were on a duck like this. Jumped off the duck, hit the slope, lost my footing, rolled all the way to the bottom, and behind us you could hear the machine guns going. That's how it was.
And could you run away? Was there any place to run away to?
Yeah. But that death march lasted about 2 weeks. And we had a lot of experiences on that death march. The first night, they marched us 53 kilometers. 53 kilometers is the distance between Johannesburg and Pretoria.
It's far.
And well, I was so far gone I couldn't march. And then we came across a wagon. The wagon was loaded with possessions of the guards, the SS guards. Look, a lot of the things that happened are almost coincidence. You're religious, you want to call it a miracle, you can call it a miracle. As our column marched past, the SS grabbed hold of me and they made me get on top of that wagon where most of the possessions of the SS were, and which had most of them already collapsed, fall on the ground. And they told me my job was to see that it didn't collapse any further. The last thing I remember was climbing on top of that wagon, and then I passed out. I don't know how long I lay on that wagon, but everything collapsed again, including trapping my Dutch blanket. I rolled off it. The wagon was being pushed by the prisoners, so I got hold of the back of it. And instead of pushing it, I let it pull me. Wow. And then I realized that the SS rucksacks were hanging from the back of that wagon. There was one of them dangling in front of my nose. I looked inside. Oh yes. As the camp was evacuated, it was evacuated one barrack at a time. Every inmate of every barrack was given a sausage and a loaf of bread. But somehow, by the time that our turn came, there were no more sausages and no more bread. But I had this thing dangling in front of me. I waited, it was at night, I waited until the moon, a cloud had gone over the moon. I put my hand inside that rucksack. I found a loaf of bread, put it inside my shirt. The Dutch column was marching alongside. I went and I joined them. And that loaf of bread was the only food that we had, talking about 3 of us.
You shared it?
For 3 of us.
You see, that's because you weren't selfish. even who's to judge? But you could have just gone off and just.
But there were lots of things that happened that way.
So that loaf of bread saved you and the three of you.
A loaf of bread came in very useful. Then one day we come across a place where there must have been fighting, and a bomb or a shell must have hit a horse, and there were bits of horse lying all over the place. And quite a few of us managed to get hold of these bits of horse, and we broke branches of the trees, and we carried this meat in pieces as it was on our shoulders until the sun went down. One of our group was an American Negro.
Really?
Yeah, and he offered to play the part of chef.
On the death march?
On the death march.
Was he captured? Was he a soldier that was captured?
I thought he was a soldier. What he was, he offered to roast the meat for us. So we got to a farm, we got into the barns, and it didn't take long when we got this unbelievably unknown, wonderful smell of roast meat.
Was this the first time you've really eaten?
That, yes.
For you?
But no meat wasn't forthcoming. Sure. We waited and we waited and we waited. And eventually a whole lot of us left the barrack and we issued forth to go and have a word with our chef. He was nowhere in sight. But the meat was there. But then we realized why he'd disappeared. That meat was so tough, you couldn't even get your teeth into it. And I remember chewing that meat until I couldn't move my jaws anymore. And all we got was the juice. And to this day I say, if we'd have been able to lay our hands on that American Negro, we'd have eaten him instead of...
You got a lovely one.
Lots of things like that happened.
Did you have SS guards still guarding you at this time?
Well, there again, there was luck. This was now, we were liberated on the 2nd of May. By that time, the Germans were running so short of soldiers that they were literally scraping the barrel. And they took a lot of Germans from the concentration camps, actual inmates, and they stuck them into a German uniform and they gave them a rifle.
Really?
And they became our guards. But amongst them were people that we'd had sat around tables with. So they were not too harsh on us. Oh, there are a lot of stories like that. And eventually we got to a place called, a German village called Hanegau. Hanegau is a place where the Americans and the Russian armies met. And what used to happen was, they used to get us up with sunlight. They used to march us the whole damn day. They would give us a pittance to eat once in 3 days. A pittance to drink once in 3 days. Right? And so we wake up in the morning and the guards are telling us, get up. Carry on moving. And one of our party climbs a tree. We're in the forest, on the edge of a road. Takes a look along the road. From the east, you can see Russian tanks coming.
Wow.
On the west, you could see American jeeps. It was the place where they met.
Wow.
And he gets down from his tree and he tells the guard, he says, you go up that tree and see what we can see. And I remember that guard taking his rifle and standing it up against the tree, goes up the tree, has a look-see, comes down, takes his rifle, smashes it against the tree, throws the people away and walks. And the other guards did the same.
Wow.
Now, by that time, the boy that I was with, his name was Otto, and we were just about finished, we could hardly walk. And so we decided that we would stay in that forest for a couple of days until we could somehow recoup some of our strength. And so out of the 300 Dutchmen, 7 of us stayed in that forest. Eventually, after about 7 days, then it was 7 days, after a couple of days, we decided time to move on. There was still fighting going on around there. And the other Dutchmen, seeing that there was still fighting going on, said they weren't prepared to stay. Of course, anything could happen at any time.
Yeah.
So the 7 of us, we walked. Now, this little village, Hannegau, we had marched through it when we were still under proper SS supervision. And the whole population of the village had turned out, to watch this circus. Now, the other boy, Otto and me, we weren't able to do this 53-kilometer business. And at the end of every column, there would be a couple of SS with rifles. And those who couldn't march were shot. Simple as that. The Dutch literally risked their lives. They detached themselves from the column, the Dutch column. They walked back to the very last row where we were, and behind us were the SS with the guns. They picked up Otto and they carried him.
Wow.
Me, they grabbed, one at each arm, and they dragged me. Okay.
And that saved your life.
So it saved our lives. Now we get to Hannegau, and we're marching through Hannegau. And the whole population's come there to see this. And suddenly a child calls out. He says, "Mother, those are children." The mother says, "No, those are bandits." And I've often wondered what she really believed. The war was going to end 1 week on. She didn't have to say anything. She could have kept quiet. Was she afraid that the neighbors might hear her maybe not being too accommodating to this child? All she said to the child was, "Those are bandits." Now we've been lying in that forest.
Did they offer you any food?
No,
from the town?
Where from? Nothing.
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 You could see you were starving.
Nothing.
You must have looked
Nothing.
terrible. Nothing. They didn't offer drink or food or
nothing. Not even water. Anyway, we've now been liberated. The Russian tanks have gone past us, and the Americans are way down yonder. So, let me see how it worked out now. Yes, we started slowly marching out of that forest, about 7 of us. And we come to a Russian checkpoint. The Russians have taken over. And they asked us, "Where are you going to?" We were going home. There was one Russian there who spoke German. And he said, well, we've just liberated you. We've just saved your lives. And now you want to run away again? To me, that was the start of the Cold War. They were annoyed with us. 1 week before the end of the war, for leaving. We managed to persuade them that the quickest way to Holland from that point was not via Moscow. So they let us go. But that one German-speaking Russian said, you've got to be careful. He said, further on, he says, the road is going to split. There'll be a fork in the road. He said, a couple of days ago, he said, a whole group of you Dutchmen came through here. That was the group, that was our group. And they ran into an SS ambush who murdered a lot.
Wow.
Now, while we were walking, we'd come across a group of Dutch SS. And some of the cleverer ones in our group had started swearing and cursing at these blokes. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if they were the ones who later opened fire.
Wow.
Years later, I wrote a letter to Holland telling of that experience. I said, if you come across any Waffen-SS that came from that part of the world, ask them a couple of questions.
So there were actually Dutch SS people?
Yes, they were
from
talking
Dutch
Dutch.
that had volunteered to be in the
they were talking
SS.
Dutch. Anyway, we get back to we get back to that German village. We get to the village square, we sit down and rest. And all of a sudden, not a German in sight. The doors were closed, the windows were closed, everything. They were dead scared of us. All of a sudden, a door opens, a little blonde German girl comes running out. Now Otto, look, I was 14 at the time, and people thought I was 11. He was 11, and people thought he was 6. That's what he looked like, right? For some reason, this little girl, instead of running to him, who's nearer his age, she makes a beeline for me, and she starts playing with me. And I played with her, and the Dutchmen stood around, and they just watched us. It was such a normal thing to do, to hear, to play with a child. I had a little sister who was sure I would never see again. Maybe that influenced me, I don't know. After a while, she went back into her home. And some of the Dutchmen turned around to me and they said, how could you? You're a Jewish boy. How could you? Your whole bloody family's been murdered. And you sit here and you play with a little German girl. But I felt I'd done nothing wrong. And I was only too pleased to play with that child. It was such a normal thing to do.
So true. Don Krausz, by this time, did you know what had happened to your mother and your sister?
No.
You know there was...
There's one thing I was sure of. I would never see them again.
Were you sure of that?
Yeah. We were walking over corpses. Anyway, we make our way back to Holland. I don't go looking for family. We had a large family there. I don't go looking for family. I thought there's no point. What I do go looking for is the Dutch friends that we had, the Goyim. But the Dutch had had a very, very rough time during the Second World War. There was something called the Hunger Winter, where between 20 and 50,000 Dutchmen died of hunger. But anyway, I go one day and I catch transport to another town and I go and look up old Dutch friends of ours, the family Van Hulten. And as I say, I don't know what I'll find. I ring the bell, Mrs. Van Hulten opens the door. She looks at me for a while, didn't recognize me. Might have lost a bit of weight. And then she says, "Why, it's Don." She says, "You know, we heard from your mother and sister this morning."
You heard that they shared that morning?
They had been liberated by the Swedish Red Cross from Ravensbruk concentration camp. They were taken to Sweden. My mother's born in England. She eventually got her way back to to England. From there, they contacted those same people.
Wow, this is unbelievable. Did you manage to make immediate contact with your mother?
I'm sorry?
Were you then able to make immediate contact with your mother?
3 months later, I was in England. A year later, I was in South Africa, where most of my mother's family was.
And you came with your mother as well? She came with you to South Africa?
Not immediately, but eventually we did.
And your sister?
Also. My sister lives here in Johannesburg.
And how did they survive the camp?
Photos were taken of them by the Swedes in Sweden after the war. My mother and sister look as though they never lacked anything at all. That's how it was. And I was skeletal.
But they must have also had it must have been terrible for them to be in the camp as well.
Of course it was.
Of course.
But my mother worked in factories, Siemens, and they looked after their workers. The Siemens factory in Ravensbruk looked after its workers. Of course, I've seen the photos that my sister brought back of these people that came from the Siemens factory. They don't look too bad at all. They don't look like what we look like.
And your sister, did she work? Where did she
Look,
work?
no, my sister was a baby practically.
She was younger than you?
Oh yes. When the war started, I was 9 years old, and my sister must have been 4.
It was just the two of you?
Just the two of us.
Don, can I ask you, when you see a Siemens product today, what is, I'm sure most people have asked this to you, would you buy a Siemens product? Or do you have mixed feelings?
Never mind a Siemens product. What made me go to German schools and talk about the Holocaust? That's the question. Especially the school here in Sanssouci that was run by Nazis.
We're here in South Africa, in Johannesburg.
There are not too many survivors, I can tell you that story. But I felt that I had something to tell them. Not so much the teachers, the children.
And were they receptive when you spoke?
No. They felt that they were victims.
The German students?
Oh yes.
Did they show any sympathy, any empathy for you, or?
The headmaster of the Sanssouci school told me Look, I first phoned the bloke, told him exactly who I was. I'm a Holocaust survivor. I want to come and have a chat with you. So I get to see him. We speak for about 3/4 of an hour. His coffee was good, by the way.
I know, it's all good.
His coffee was good. And we got on very well together. Until I mentioned why I'd come. I said, I want to talk to your pupils. Now, the staff at the German schools, and I got this from the teachers, they were only here for 3 months at a time. 3 months. Might have been 3 years. Anyway, they were only here for a short time. Then they had to go back to Germany. So that headmaster said to me, if he'd have known what I was going to say, I would never have come across the doorstep.
Really?
And I'd asked him, I said, do you teach the Holocaust here? Oh yes. How do you teach it? Tells me how he teaches it. But then he said, had you known after I'd spoken, at the time there were 2,000 kids. It's a big school, 2,000 kids there.
What year roughly was this?
Sorry?
What year was this that you went to speak to the school?
Maybe 1985. Whatever it was, he made it clear to me. Had he known what I was going to say, I would never have come across the doorstep. And it took me another 20 years to get into that school. But by that time, the Goethe Institute had opened here. Have you been to the Goethe Institute?
I see, I've heard of, yeah.
And they went out of their way to contact the survivors.
They've had a very positive...
They were very positive.
And very...
And I got to know the man in charge there. And so 20 years after speaking at the German school, I phoned him. I said, look, it's now 20 years. I said, 20 years ago I got kicked out. He said, look, this is the name of the headmaster. This is the phone number. Phone him. He said, if within 15 minutes you haven't got an invitation, he says, you contact. And that's when I got back to the Johannesburg German school.
In the second time when you spoke, it was much more...
It was more or less the same, but they were not the same teachers.
But the students, were they interested in hearing what you had to say?
Yes.
Did they ask questions? Did they...
More or less. But now listen to this. Before I got to speak at that first school, the headmaster, after he'd recovered from the shock of me telling him I want to talk to his children, he said he can't decide that. Not for him to decide. It's for the history teachers at his school to first pronounce on this. All right? Now, at the time, we had an ex-chair lady here by the name of Leah Leibovitz. She was doing a course on Holocaust studies at Wits. And I started thinking, I've got to speak to the German teachers. What am I likely to be up against? One very great possibility was Holocaust denial. So I got hold of Leah Leibovitz. Look, today, with that library you see there, I don't think there's a question I couldn't answer.
Sure.
But that was a long time ago. So we are now introduced to the German teachers. We're introduced. Our names, their names. This was 40 years after the war. There was one German teacher there who refused to shake my hand. 40 years after the war. Anyway, they had one spokeslady. And the Germans are clever, very organized. And she made us a speech. She said, look, we want you to understand clearly that we feel terrible about what happened to you people in the concentration camps. Do you understand German at all?
A little.
Das war doch ein Schande.
A shame.
It was a disgrace. And but then she prepared herself very well. She says, we can understand, speaking for her and the other teachers, how you people, victims, must feel about it. The hatred you must have. The need for revenge. All that kind of thing. Lea Leibowitz lost her husband and her 7-year-old child in Auschwitz. And now Lea Leibowitz pipes up. She says, but you needn't worry. She says, I would never do to a child of yours what you did to me.
Sure, that's...
And then she started crying.
Sure.
Anyway, I said to them, look, I said, we didn't come here to talk to you. I said, we come here to talk to the children. Your headmaster tells me that you teach the Holocaust. Fine. You ask your children if they're prepared to have me talk to them. If they do, you know how to contact me. If not, it's your business. 20 years went by.
They never contacted you?
That's when the chap from the Goethe Institute stepped into the breach. And the next school that I spoke at was in Pretoria. Now, any school, I've spoken to more than 500 schools. Any school I speak at.
All in South Africa?
Here, Australia, Zimbabwe, all over the show. I've got something to tell.
You were there.
Anyway, any school you go to, if it's a school where you haven't been before, I'm sorry, am I holding you up?
Not at all, not one. But this is...
Have some more to drink.
All good. Done well.
I get to the Germans. Any school you go to, they appoint a member of staff to show you around, to tell you where to find the class that you must talk to, and so on. At the German school in Pretoria, that's also what happened. I was given a guide. Who was my guide? She was a Mrs. Schindler.
Sure. Any relation?
That's what I asked her. She said no. But after that, with a completely new set of teachers, they went out of their way to invite me to their get-togethers, to their meetings, to their festivals, what have you. It was as though I was a member of the staff.
Don, I mentioned earlier that my wife and I were in Fellbach, near Stuttgart, for a big stamp exhibition of Germany and Israel, where they issued two German stamps with Israel on, and they had the Israeli flag. It was a special German-Israel joint exhibition. In honor of Israel. They issued a stamp which said Deutschland and Israel from the Deutsche Post, and it had a cancellation of the Brandenburg Gate and the menorah. I had read in the South African Jewish paper that the German ambassador had invited Holocaust survivors to his home. That was Martin Schaffer. And I was very impressed with that article. And I was very impressed that he had personally invited them to meet the Holocaust survivors. So I contacted somebody said I should contact the embassy, which I did. And I said I'd like to donate I'd like to donate the original, the stamps with the first aid cover, with the cancellation from that very special exhibition. And they wrote back to me, and we made an appointment. And then they said, unfortunately, he's not here, but the head of the cultural department of the German embassy would like to meet me. So last week I met with Herbert Bernhardt in the embassy in Pretoria, and I gave for him and for the ambassador the envelope with the cancellation, with the Brandenburg Gate, and with the menorah, and the 2 stamps with Germany and Israel. And they were very appreciative. And I think there has been a tremendous change in the perception of Holocaust studies and Israel and Germany. And I think in South Africa you have played a very pivotal and a very important part in breaking down those barriers. By you personally initiating the contact, it took tremendous courage from you. You are a tremendous hero. For you to do that, it must have been extremely difficult. And
it was an obligation.
But that's the type of person you are. You did something that is not comfortable, and you were not paid to do it. I think you did it because you really wanted to do it. You wanted to educate the future generation, German generation, and to tell them a bit of the history that they would understand. And I think you broke down barriers.
There's one thing I haven't told you. Pretoria School. It's a bit of a long story.
We've got as long time as you want, as much time as you want.
After the war, I was contacted by a German woman who was lecturing at a German university, and she wanted to investigate child survivors. How she came to me, I don't know, but she did. We corresponded until the day she died, maybe a year ago.
She was living in Germany?
Sorry?
Where was she living?
She was living in Germany. And we corresponded for many years. Now, here was a woman, she's an intelligent person. She's at the university, she's lecturing. She's written books. I've got one of her books here. And we discuss many things. And there's one thing I'm convinced of. That woman is not an anti-Semite. If she was an anti-Semite, she would never have taken the first step in that direction.
Yeah.
Right? We didn't always agree on what we wrote to each other, but it was a cordial, friendly conversation that extended for years. And when 2 years ago I was sent to Poland, my intention was that from Poland, instead of coming back via Israel, I would go to Germany and look her up. But I wrote to her and there was never an answer. I assumed that she must have died. I mean, she was older than I was. Now, one of the things that she wrote to me that nearly put an end to that conversation was, here's a woman that's gone out of her way to investigate the fate of Jewish children in German concentration camps. We know today that 1.5 million of those children were murdered, never mind died, right?
Yeah.
And she writes to me, she says, we are not monsters, meaning the Germans. When she wrote that, I could have said, is that so?
Yeah.
thanks very much. Thanks for the memory type of thing. But then I thought, this woman is not an anti-Semite. She wouldn't have taken the first step in that direction otherwise. Why is she saying that? There must be a reason. So I started reading up on the history of Germany from 1918 to 1933, when Hitler came to power. And I came to the conclusion that the Germans had a very, very rough time. They needed soup kitchens in the streets, right? Their finances came to nothing. The unemployment was something like 60%. They had problems. Not only that, I was born in 1930. About 1931-32, a lot of German youth left Germany and started traveling to surrounding countries, preferably countries that hadn't been involved in the war, in order to try and get jobs. There were no jobs for them in Germany. So one of them, a girl by the name of Liesel, she wasn't Jewish. She came to my parents and wanted to work as an au pair. They took her into their home. They made her a member of the family. We had a large family in Holland, and we used to travel around Holland and visit them from time to time. And when we did, we always used to take Liesel with.
Wow.
So Liesel knew of these people. She knew where they lived. She knew of their addresses. And then after Hitler had made his mark, her parents wrote to her and said, look, things have now improved, you can come back. And that's the last that I saw her. She taught me German. She taught me German lieder. She was a member of the family. Now the war's over. I come back to Holland. I found the one remaining member of my family there, an aunt of mine, who'd been in hiding. And she tells me how before I got back to Holland, one day there's a knock on her door and there stands Liesel. She recognizes the girl. She wants to invite her in. Liesel doesn't want to come in. She only got one question. What's happened to the Krauszes?
Wow.
And my aunt tells her they don't know. All they know is that the Germans took her away. And my aunt told her how Liesel burst into tears, turned around and ran down the street. Liesel was not an anti-Semite.
Yeah.
So it was one of the things that prompted me to go to the German schools, to try and tell them that not every German was an anti-Semite. I met Germans in the camps who were staunch Nazis, but they were very nice people. I was about 13. They brought in a girl one day who must have been maybe 19. Pretty girl, nice girl. I was wearing the Morgan David, right? Didn't put her off. We used to have many a conversation. But I knew I had to be very, very careful what I said to this girl.
She was not Jewish.
No.
She was a German girl.
She was a Nazi.
A Nazi, wow.
She could never stop praising Hitler, telling me the wonders that Hitler had performed for Germany. And I knew I had to be very careful how I handled it. And one day I was standing by the window overlooking the camp. Ravensbruk at the time, 50,000 German women. 50,000 women had been killed by the Nazis. And I said to this girl, I don't even know what her name is anymore. I said, if Hitler was standing where I'm standing now, by the window, looking out over this concentration camp, what do you think his attitude would be? And she looked at me, she says, he wouldn't ever allow it. It was things like that that changed my outlook. I know what the Germans have done. I've got books and books and books on it there. My father was murdered. 40 members of my family were murdered. I know something about what the Nazis have done. But I felt an obligation to talk to the German youth. And that's why I went to the German schools. The reaction differed. Some of them saw themselves as the victims instead of me. But in that Pretoria school that I went to, and I went to several times, I'd finished my talk and I was walking on the way to my car, and a little German girl came running after me, and all she said was, "Thank you."
Wow.
I don't know what I said, but it must have had a meaning to that child.
Absolutely.
And that's the reason I went there. I don't hate anybody. I don't want to hate anybody.
And Don, going back, I know it might sound a bit foolish, but would you buy, or did you ever buy a Siemens product?
Would I?
Did you ever buy a Siemens product, knowing that your mother was forced labor for Siemens?
A boss of mine
You can continue.
gave me an Opel car.
It's a German car.
No.
Don, I asked, knowing that your mother was in the forced labor for Siemens, have you ever bought, or would you ever buy a Siemens product and a German
I prefer
product?
not to.
Okay, because your mother was in forced labor.
Maybe yes.
And maybe because your father was
Murdered.
murdered, yeah.
Not only my father and 4 members of his family.
The entire family. Wow. But you were given an Opel car.
My boss gave me an Opel car. And I had option's choice. I accepted it. But when I was in a position to buy my own car, I got rid of that car very, very quickly. There's nothing wrong with it,
Yeah.
except its origin. I've had a lot to do with Germans since then. My neighbour here was a German. We used to have talks together. We got on well together. I tell him about the camps, and he told me how when he was a soldier, after the Normandy invasion of the Western Front.
Sure. That's
You
interesting.
know, it's people, human beings.
And you developed a friendship with your
I
neighbor.
didn't develop a friendship, but I certainly didn't hate him.
But you spoke to each other. You had
Spoke to each other. Yeah. I don't hate anybody. I don't want to hate anybody.
That is such an important message that you give.
Come, I want to show you something.
No. Don, you call it a coincidence, but I think it's a miracle. I think it's Mina Shamayim.
That's the difference between you and me.
I'm actually convinced it is. But imagine when you go back to Holland after being liberated and you go back to the non-Jewish neighbor people that you knew and you knock on their door and they recognize you even though they don't recognize you because your appearance, you must have looked like a living skeleton.
Lost a bit of weight.
But and when you mention who you are and they say the same day that they heard that your mother and your sister had contacted them, how was your feeling? You must have been, you thought they were all had been murdered and now thank God you've got a mother and a sister.
I must have been pleased. There's one other story I want to tell you. Rotterdam's been flattened. The centre of Rotterdam, where we lived, goes back to 1603. Mm-hmm. The houses are marked 1603. Now, about 6 months later, we're back. I find that in this whole area that has been literally pulverized, there are only 3 buildings left. One is the hospital, which is intentional, of course. The second is the town hall, which is also on purpose. The third are 2 stories of our school. The others were burnt down. So I go back to the school. Now I'm back at the school. One day I come out of school a bit late. And I see what to me is a horrible sight. I see a boy who I don't recognize, cowering against the wall of the school, and my classmates are throwing stones at him. I wasn't the biggest and strongest boy in the class. But I went up to my mates and said, what's going on here? They said, his father is the biggest Nazi in Rotterdam. It turns out that his father was the Italian consul. And this boy was in one of the classes. No, I didn't know about Holocaust in those days. I didn't know what lay ahead. All I knew was that what they were doing to that boy was wrong. I get hold of him and I said, now look, from today, you don't leave school unless I'm with you. Wow. Every day, his name was Pietro. He was intelligent. He was loyal to his parents. He would never run them down. Even though when we used to get to his home, and every day I took him to his home, we would sit down on the pavement outside and he'd apologize to me for the fact that he couldn't invite me in because being Jewish, his parents wouldn't approve.
And they were Italian?
Yeah. They would not approve of him bringing a Jewish boy into the house. And this went on until the Germans removed us. Okay. Now the war's over. I come back to Rotterdam. I'm walking in Rotterdam one day and I suddenly hear a very excited voice shouting, "Don, you're still alive!" There was something, I turned around and there stands this Italian boy. There was something in those words, "You're still alive," that was a little bit uncomfortable. And I said, yes, I'm still alive. And I walked in.
Did he come running after you?
No. But you could see he was pleased to see me. There's no reason why I shouldn't have been.
But he didn't want to ask where you were?
Not. The implication of those words, "You're still alive,"
it's difficult,
was more than I could take. I said, yes, I'm still alive.
And you never met him again?
You understand Hebrew?
Sure.
Yesh Sipurim.
There are stories. When you heard that your mother and your sister were still alive, I mean, thank God that you still had a mother and a sister. How did you manage to get to England, to meet them in England?
Getting to England wasn't so big a problem. You see, my father was Hungarian. According to the law of the land at the time, if a person married a Hungarian, they became Hungarian. So the fact that my mother was born in England still meant that she'd lost her nationality. And the fact that we were Hungarian and not Dutch saved our lives. Because the Hungarians were allies of the Germans.
That's why you were sent to that camp and not to
That is correct.
to Auschwitz or
That is
Majdanek.
That is correct. Anyway, I didn't get to England until about, I think, October of that year.
Who looked after you during this time? You were only a boy of, how old were you, 15 at this time?
When I escaped from what they call the Vernichtungslager, I knew where to go to. I knew what the number of the Dutch barrack was, and I made my way there. One of the Dutchmen there had been a member of the Dutch resistance, and he sort of took me under his wing. When I went to Holland, he was with me. When I stayed behind, because I couldn't walk any further, in that German forest, he stayed with me. And he told me, when I got to Holland, that if I didn't find anybody there to take me home, he would adopt me. I found people. Right? I found an aunt. I found this Dutch neighbor of ours, and there was Mr. Noble, the man I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So I got to England about, must have been around about October, I think it was. Thanks to Mr. Jan Smuts.
Really? Thanks to Jan Smuts.
Thanks to Jan Smuts.
If you could tell our listeners, how did Jan Smuts have an
It took
influence?
us about a year for me to get into South Africa.
But how did you go to England? Did the joint, did the
To
Jewish
the
organ-
military aircraft, a military Dakota.
they took you from Holland to England?
Yeah.
And then
I must tell you something else anyway, you know your way.
So, how long did you stay in England with your mother? First of all, how was the reaction? Not how long did you stay. When you first saw your mother and your sister,
Frankly, I don't remember. I couldn't have been too upset.
but it must have been so emotional seeing them again after all these years.
I wasn't emotional about anything.
Because you had seen so much. You had
Look,
witnessed.
my job in the camps was to remove the corpses every morning
Oy,
at the age of 14.
oy, my God.
I was unemotional about it. At the age of 14,
It
I
was your
joined the
job.
Gevre Kadisha.
Wow. God, that's unbelievable.
Huh? Now,
But did you feel, I mean, being separated from your mother and your sister for, it was a few years, did you feel an immediate bond with your mother and your sister? I know it's a
I wasn't close to them anymore.
which is understandable.
Mhm.
Did they ask you questions, what you went through?
No. Why? It took me about a year from England to get here to South Africa. The family in South Africa had been advised by members of the Jewish community that the condition of Holocaust survivors was such was best not to regurgitate any memories. Of course, it would upset them and all sorts of other terrible things with them. What it did do was this. I got to South Africa, I went to school here. From school, I went to Rhodesia. An uncle of mine had started a factory there. I ran that factory for him. When I came back, when I got married, my wife was working for one of the top psychiatrists in this country, a chap by the name of Zalman Wolf. And between the two of them, it didn't take them long to work out that I could do with a little bit of help. And he put me back on my feet again. I didn't want to know anybody. I had no friends. To this day I don't make friends. I don't feel the need for it.
But you had told your wife before you got married, you told that you were a Holocaust survivor.
Oh, yes.
She knew.
Oh yes. Look, when I came to this country I joined up on him. And it didn't take them long to work out. And if you see the pictures taken of Harbonim where I participate, I'm the only one there who's not smiling.
And can I ask, what school did you go to?
Highlands North.
Highlands North.
Practically a Jewish school.
And did you tell any of your schoolmates that you were where you were during the war?
Not at the time.
Nobody knew?
Nobody knew.
Nobody asked?
But then one day something happened. We had an English teacher, a Miss Benson. And this was at the time when the Irgun got hold of 2 British sergeants and hanged them.
But that was in retaliation for what the British had done.
Whatever you want to call it.
They didn't just get hold of
Miss Benson cancelled the English lesson that day. And she told us how the whole of the Second World War had been fought by England on behalf of the Jews.
Wow. And you sitting in this lesson?
I'm sitting there listening to it. Now, my English still wasn't too good. I didn't argue with them. I was in a class with South Africans, of which at least 1 in 4 must have been Jewish.
Yeah.
Highlands North.
Sure, it was a very Jewish,
Nobody said a word. And I thought, this is ridiculous. So I got up on my hind legs and I gave Miss Benson a bit of an argument. And she got very upset with me. Started shouting. She said, you don't know what you're talking about. I said, I know exactly what I'm talking about. I was there. And this went on for a bit, and it became quite a heated exchange. And then I became aware of other kids in the class shouting at me, Krausz, sit down, shut up. I looked around me, it was the Jewish kids.
The Jewish kids? What do you say?
Then I sat down, then I shut up. Class is over, everybody leaves, I'm the last one out of the class. I walk out of the door, all the Gorsha kids are waiting for me. And frankly, I thought this was a lynching party. I'd been through that before in the camps with non-Jews. And all they said to me was, tell us about those camps.
The non-Jewish kids?
Not one Jewish kid there.
Wow.
And I spoke to them for about 15 minutes. Yesh Sipurima.
And the teacher, did she ever apologize to you, or did she ever...
Not apologize. There was one Jewish teacher in that school. He got hold of me afterwards. he took me into an unoccupied schoolroom, and he conducted a conversation with me in whispers. What happened? What did you say? What did they say to you? And he was a captain up north, Mr. Ralston.
And he didn't give you support?
Well, I left school and went to Dublin. If you see the photos of Harbonim, and I've got quite a few of them, where they're dancing and singing and dancing to horror and whatnot, there's only one person there who's not smiling and not participating. Understandable.
It's very understandable. What isn't understandable?
I went to Israel. I lived there for 4.5 years.
Really? You went. This is before you were married.
Yes. Yes, I was completely. I had my dira there, I had my flat there. I was completely at home there.
Where were you living?
I was actually based in Tel Aviv, but I was drilling for oil, and so I was moving all around the countryside. Let me show you something. This is all in Hebrew. This is my job. Dirkman. This bloke, I worked with him.
Really, in the picture? We had this book in my grand's place, yeah. Wow.
This is the height of a 10-story building.
Wow.
And that was my job, Dirkman.
And Don, in the picture behind us, in the pictures behind us.
All right. These are my parents. These are my wife's parents.
So that picture of your parents was taken in, that was taken in Holland, in Rotterdam, most probably.
They got married in England, so that's probably in England. This I don't know. This might even have been in Lithuania.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. And how old were you when you were in Israel for about 4 years?
Sorry?
You were in Israel for about 4 years.
4.5 years.
And then what made you decide to come back?
My sister got married. She sent me a ticket.
And did you?
While I was here, I met my wife.
And did your sister? Did she have any? Did she have any problems making friends, becoming more South African? Did the war?
She's got friends, but I'm not sure that I'm one of them.
I'm sure you are. I'm sure you're the closest friend. But at school, did it affect her the same way it affected you? It also affected her.
Yes.
It must have affected
She's
her.
a very pretty girl. And there was a lot of resentment. And she spoke up for herself.
Resentment by the other South African girls?
I'm sorry?
Who resented? The other South African, her classmates?
She was actually in Rhodesia at the time. Because we lived there for about 4.5 years.
In which city in Rhodesia?
Bulawayo.
Bulawayo.
Yeah, she went to a school there, and they weren't too happy with her. And she wasn't too happy with them.
Why weren't they happy with her?
Maybe anti-Semitism.
was in those days, Rhodesia was part of the British Commonwealth. It was, and we're talking about.
I'm talking now about, say, 1949 to 1954.
It's after the mandate and after the establishment of the State of Israel. Yeah. So you had even coming to South Africa wasn't so simple. You had a difficult journey. You had an eventful, difficult journey. But to see you smiling, to see you, it's so heartwarming to see.
In Rhodesia, I became a shooting instructor for the Rhodesian Army.
Really? Wow.
Huh?
And where did your sister get married? In South Africa? Or Rhodesia?
She got married in South Africa.
And you came back to live in South Africa?
I didn't want to. I was settled in Israel. But these people were old and sick. And my wife didn't want to leave them. So I stayed put.
And how old were you when you got married?
Must have been about... asking me a question now. Maybe 31 or so, or something.
And your wife, was she younger than you?
No, we're the same age.
The same age.
Exactly. That's still there.
And you had children?
No. No, that's one calamity that I never have to.
Oh, that's your wife there. Wow.
This is my wife. This is the one that I'm proud of, because it shows the relationship between the father and the daughter.
Wow.
They were very close.
It's amazing. So
He was a fine man, this.
Can you tell us who's in this photo?
Yes.
This is... Can you explain to us who's in the photo?
Sorry?
Don, can you explain who's in the photo?
Yes. Well, his name was Levy. That's his wife. That's his other daughter. These are his grandchildren.
Okay.
I'm not in the picture.
Why aren't you in the picture?
You look at this and I'm going to the toilet.
Don, as head of the
Just while
chairman.
on the subject, I was interrogated by the Gestapo at one stage.
You were interrogated.
They never laid a finger on me, but I came out of there with my pants full. You've got to be lucky. The man who did the interrogation, he took me into an adjoining room. He was asking me questions, which I tried to avoid answering. He took me into an adjoining room, and they had instruments of torture hanging on the wall. Thumb screws, whips, all sorts of things. And he told me he'd be most upset about it if he had to use them on me. But he needed the information which he knew I had. I walked out of there with my pants full. He told me to come and see him the following day. He'd spent a couple of days already with me, trying to get my confidence and so on. Why? Because he'd rescued me from a bunch of gypsies that just about making goulash of me.
Right.
And but then he put his cards on the table. He knew that I, having lived with the gypsies in the same barrack, he must have known which ones of them had diamonds.
Wow.
And he wanted those diamonds. and I did not feel under any obligation to contribute to the German war effort. So I denied all knowledge. And that's when eventually he took me to the other room and he showed me what lay ahead. He told me to come back the following day and to think about it very, very carefully, what he'd said to me. I come back the following day and he's gone. That's how he's been replaced.
Wow, that's another miracle.
Now, I'm not a religious person, but there are times when I'm inclined to think that somebody may have had a hand in it.
Of course they did. And there's no question.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, he wanted the information from you,
Oh, yes.
and if he would have shot you, he would never have got the information. But he could
He
have
wouldn't have
used.
shot me. He'd have tortured me.
Yeah, but he could have done it there and then. There's no question. It's a miracle. There's no
Because
question.
he knew, and I knew,
Wow.
who had those diamonds. And these were people that were knocking me around and made life very, very unpleasant.
And what happened to those gypsies?
They survived.
They survived.
Not so very long ago, I still got a garus from one of them.
Wow, you're still in contact.
I wasn't friendly with them. I didn't want anything to do with them. But the impression had been made. I caught them once. You know what a Muslim was? A Muslim actually means a Muslim. It means a person who's been run down to the extent where you can't get any more work out of him. And that leaves only one thing to do, and that's the gas chamber. And these people, they used to roam around the camp until the time came to put them onto a train, after which you never saw them again. That was a Muslim. And one day there were about 80 of these German gypsies in the barrack, and there weren't more than about 13 of us Jewish boys. And they used to knock the living daylights out of us, very much to the amusement of their elders.
But why would they do it? Why would they?
Sadism. They were German gypsies. They'd been in the German army until somebody discovered they weren't pure Aryan. Oh, yes. Yes, Ipurim.
So even though they were in the same camp, they still had
Their families had been murdered in Auschwitz.
and they still took it out on
Oh,
Jewish
yeah.
boys.
Anyway, one day one of these Muslim men walks into the barrack, and these gypsies get hold of him, and they knock the living daylights out of him. The Muslim manages to escape. I get hold of the leader of these German boys, of these gypsy boys, a chap by the name of Menelo. And I said to him, now supposing I said that the roles would have been diverse, it would have been 80 of us and 17 of you. I said, and we'd get stuck in to one of yours the way you got stuck in to that Muslim. What would your attitude be? Or would be horrified? The following day, that same stupid Muslim walks into the barrack again, and the same thing happens. Years go by. And that boy who I brought out of the camp with me to Holland, he used to go and talk in Germany, give lectures there. And he met up with the gypsies again, and they declared him an honorary gypsy. Where he fitted in the word honorary, I don't quite know, but he was now a gypsy. The last time he was here, a couple of years ago, he said, "I've got a good news for you." This boy, Menelman. Well,
Wow.
strange, isn't it? Very, very strange.
Yes, he still remembered. Yeah.
Something I said there must have impacted.
It struck a chord, yeah. That's incredible.
Because they were as cruel to their own as they were to us, the German gypsies. And I found out later from European gypsies that they wanted nothing to do with those German gypsies.
The German gypsies.
Yeah.
So Don, with all this, and you still had the desire to go to the German schools, to speak, to educate.
I felt I had a message for them. I felt I had something to say to them. Number one, I didn't hate them. Number two, I shouldn't be hating anybody.
Yeah.
And that's where, to me, one of the most gratifying moments was when that one little girl came running after me, and all she said was, "Thank you."
Thank you.
She wasn't a gypsy, but she was a German. She was in the German school in Pretoria. And that's what she said, "Thank you."
And Don, can I just ask, when you went back to Poland 2 years ago, so you were 86 when you went back.
I was.
How old were you? 86?
Continue.
How old were you when you went back to Poland? You were...
Look, I'm 88 now. I must have been about 86.
86.
Uh-huh.
How was it going back to Poland? It must have been very
I didn't
difficult.
want to go back. The worst anti-Semites in the concentration camp were the Poles.
What do you say? More than the German?
Yeah. The ones who treated us the worst were the Poles. Look, from Ravensbruk in Holland, we were sent to a women's camp because we were children. And we were placed in various barracks. Now, Ravensbruk concentration camp, where 50,000 women and about 20,000 men died, had been established in 1939. Like most of those concentration camps, in the beginning, it was established by German inmates, political opponents of the regime, criminals, and so on. The Jews came afterwards. The reason I'm telling you that is this, that by the time that the Jews arrived there with their children, the inmates there hadn't seen their own children for years. They couldn't keep their hands off our babies. I mean, we had children there in nappies. And they wanted to be with those children all the time. Goyim,
Non-Jews, yeah.
purely Goyim. They wanted to be with the children. I wasn't counted as a child. I mean, I was 13 at the time. Then they transferred us to a Polish barrack. And that became hell on earth. Because the Poles, the only Polish expression that I learned there was Żyd pszakrew, which is something like dog of a Jew. Wow. And they were bloody awful to us. They were the worst anti-Semites in the camp, the Poles. After about 4 months of this, we Jews were placed in another barrack, which was a big improvement. But in the meantime, the damage had been done. And we were virtually in the hands of those Poles. Now, I'm asked to go to Auschwitz. That was a couple of years ago, about 2 years ago, as some kind of a guide, instructor, what have you.
For which organization?
Sorry?
Who asked you to go?
Italy.
Okay.
I don't think it was out of malice or forethought, but
You went. And did you go with the South
There
African
is-
group?
I went with the South African group. There were people there from all over the world, America, whatnot. And they told me already here that I'd be expected to give a lecture to the Polish youth when I got there, which I did. It's a lecture which I'll probably never forget. And
In what way? Was it a difficult lecture to give? Or were they receptive to you?
I've got a book here on the righteous Gentiles from all over the world, including the Poles. And it showed you what the Poles did to the Jews. Right? When I was asked to give that address to the Polish youth in Poland, I took with an extract from that book and I gave it to them. Sort of put that in your pipe and smoke it. Because they were monstrous. As were the Hungarians, as were the Estonians, as were the Lithuanians.
And the Latvians, yeah, that's true. But there was a family, the Ulmer family.
Sorry?
There was a family, the Ulmer family in Poland, with a mother with 7 children, and she hid Jews, friends, and in the countryside they were peasants. They were informed on, and
They?
they were informed, and the whole family, including the 7 children, and the parents were killed for hiding Jews. So there were, and there is a memorial for the righteous. There were,
Yeah, it was the exception.
it was an exception, but there were.
Oh, sure.
But your experience in the camps, I mean, you had the real experience with the Poles in the camps, and it was
I would
terrible.
say the Poles were the worst.
Sure.
Now, I get to Poland. Never been to Poland. I read books and books on Poland. I've spoken to people who came from Poland, they were in the camps. I know what the story is. I'm more interested in the reaction of the Poles to us than being shown the various statues and what have you. So when we are taken for walks around various cities in Poland, I'm not so much looking at these. Would you like some more to drink?
It's all good.
I'm not so much looking at the statuary and the places where the ghettos had been, and so on, and the camps that they took us with, and the places of slaughter. I'm looking at the Poles. Of course, the time when we used to leave our hotels to go walking around Poland was about the same time as the Polish working class was going out. And I looked at them and they looked at me. Sorry, they did not look at me. I looked at them. And I saw how they would avert their eyes from us. And those who did not avert their eyes from us, you know, we wore Magane David. Those who did not avert their eyes from us did not look upon us with favour. That was the Poles as far as I was concerned.
And when you gave the talk in the school, how was the reaction to the children?
Look, those children were handpicked. And I gave them an example of how Poles treated Jews. I told them a story that was true, how the Poles treated Jews.
There were stories even after the war when the Jews came back.
Kiels?
And they were killed, sure.
Kiels?
Yeah.
You know, I mentioned Kiels. The Jews returned from the camps to Kiels, and the Poles there promptly killed them.
Yeah.
After the war.
After the war, sure. There was a group of B'nai Kiva youth as well that returned after the war, and they were also killed. And the cemetery is in Lodge. In the Lodge cemetery, you see the graves of the B'nai Kiva youth that were killed after the war by Poles. But there were some that risked their lives, like the Ulmer family and the Righteous Gentiles. They do have a museum that we went to, and they show that there were also those exceptions, but there were as well.
The story I told them was this. There was a Polish nurse. And one day a man who used to work in the forests brought her a Jewish baby that he'd found abandoned in the forest. She was a nurse, she was not Jewish. She took the baby and she looked after it. Now the good citizens of the village where she was pointed out to her that there's one thing you mustn't blame the Germans for. They got rid of the Jews. You know, it was a mitzvah. And it's now up to her to get rid of that Jewish baby. She refused. I think her husband divorced her because of it. The other citizens in the village threatened to come along and kill that child. This is fact. I think her husband divorced her. Eventually, to save both herself and the child, she went to stay in another village where the same thing happened. She eventually made her way to Israel, where she converted.
Gee, that's unbelievable.
That was the story I gave them.
Wow.
You know, sort of put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Yeah. Sure. Wow, it's hard. And have you ever been back to Germany?
No,
Would you ever go back?
not if I can help it.
No, it's too painful. When did you hear about your father, that your father had been murdered? Or when did you know?
Some of my uncles came back from the concentration camps, and they told us.
Must have been devastating. But you look at what you had to do in the camps. You were surrounded with death.
The most devastating part was that they told me that he was a Muslim. He had reached a stage where there's no going back anymore. That was my father. That is par for the course.
Unbelievable. No, Don, really, what you have shared tonight, thank God, the miracles that you are here. It's not coincidence. There's a reason that you...
I believe in nothing. I don't believe in miracles. I don't believe in anything. I don't go to shul unless I have to. I believe in nothing.
But somehow a higher power, somebody was looking after you. That you survived, and there's no question. No, there's listening to your story. It's so obvious. It's not a coincidence.
Why me?
Because Hashem had a plan for you. They had a plan for you. There's no question. And look what you've achieved.
There are 6 million questions like that.
I know. Everybody, there's a lot of questions. But I've met people that went through and remained their faith. They still remain very committed.
All I can tell you is this. It took one of the top psychiatrists a long, long time to put me back on my feet. And I remember one occasion when I told him a story, which to me was hearsay. A story of a massacre, which I had not seen, which I had not experienced. But it reduced me to tears. And I said to this man, this psychiatrist, I said, why am I crying? I wasn't there. I didn't see it. And all he said was, there's a lot of pain.
I tell you why it's a miracle, Don, and I tell you why.
I'm sorry?
I tell you why it's a miracle, and I tell you why there's a higher power, and I tell you why there's a Hashem in all this. That you do not hate, and that you had the strength to go back to a German school and speak to the teachers and the principal. There's a reason why you survived. There's no question about it. You are unique. You are a very unique.
Only to be told that had I known what I was going to say, I would not have come through the door.
But look what happened. You opened the door 20 years later, but you opened the door. You opened the door that the German ambassador would invite me to the embassy, and I would give the German Israel stamps, and it's a lot. I can thank you, because you were the one single-handedly, and that you don't have a hatred. It's incredible. To have gone through what you went through, and not to have hatred for the perpetrators.
What's the German ambassador's name again?
So the German Martin Schäfer.
Martin Schäfer.
And he invited Holocaust survivors to come to his residence. And I saw that article.
I was there. And when he did...
You were there at the...
Oh, yes.
It was in his residence.
Yes. When he was there, we survivors were asked if we had any questions. And I said to him, I haven't got a question for you. I've got a question for your daughter. I want to know, I said, you're speaking as a diplomat. You're saying what you have to say. I want to know how your daughter was influenced by you about the Holocaust. And I spoke to that girl, and she answered me accordingly. And the last time I saw Martin Schäfer, was the commemoration of Auschwitz. And I was watching him very carefully. And the last thing that he said was, when he spoke to us, when he sort of asked for forgiveness, and how sorry he was about what had happened. And he mentioned almost in an undertone, and for what my family did. Wow. And I went up to him afterwards. I said, I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank you for what you said. And I want to thank you for your sincerity.
Wow. For your honesty. Wow. Yeah. That is moving. Wow.
It must have been quite an effort for you to say that. Yeah, for what my family did.
Wow. Sure. But Don, I just want you to know from my side.
Sorry.
I want you to know from my side and from all of us that you, even though for 20 years they did not contact you back, you unlocked that door. You knocked on the door and you unlocked the door that could make such a thing possible.
I felt it was necessary.
Yeah. That's incredible. So, Don, I'd just like to ask, are there many other Holocaust survivors here in Johannesburg?
Look, I've been chairman for maybe the last 20 odd years. Today there aren't more than maybe 20 left. 20
In Johannesburg?
Yeah.
And in Cape Town, there's a few in Cape Town that I personally met.
Yes.
But in Johannesburg, only about 20.
Approximately. Look, there are people who have not come forward and identified themselves as survivors.
Well, I must just mention that it's been the greatest honor and a privilege to meet you and to hear
able to tell the story.
To hear your heart-rending. There's just no words to describe what you went through as a young boy and how you.
I didn't go through the worst.
To see
and
dead
I came
bodies
out more or
every
less
day.
intact.
You really did more than that. But as chairman of the Association of Holocaust Survivors here in Johannesburg, this community is very blessed to have somebody like you. It really is. They could never wish for a better chairman, somebody who was there, somebody who lacks the hatred after what you saw hell on earth, and you don't have the hatred. I think you are an inspiration. You are an inspiration. You are an example for all of us to emulate, really. And we can learn so much from you.
Look, be that as it may, I felt I did what had to be done.
Well, we just want to thank you. Don Krausz, it's been the greatest honor and privilege. It's been the greatest honor and privilege to meet with you, to be with you.
Can't I offer you something else to drink?
You're so kind. But I just want to...
I'll see you down to your car.
There's no need. But I just want to end off by really wishing you and my best ring. And the late Chief Rabbi Harris, you say, plus VAT. But the most important thing
he was a nice chap.
With all of Hashem's blessings, we just want to wish you in good health, with all of God's blessings, that you deserve so much, and we are and it's just been such an honor and a privilege to be with you, Don. And I really, you said you didn't have many friends. It would be an honor if you could count me as one of your friends, because you deserve everything. You really do. You're very special. You're an inspiration. And it's been such an honor to meet you tonight and to hear what you went through and how you overcome the insurmountable obstacles and hell on earth, and how you survived and how you're smiling.
I still think of them every night.
I can imagine.
There's something that goes through my mind.
But that you can smile is a miracle in itself. So I want to thank you, and we just wish you just everything, all the good things.
All right.